Chapter 1. Returning to the island. A small motorboat cut swiftly across the slate-gray waters of the Chesapeake Bay, closing the distance between the mainland and a distant island. Other islands dotted the surroundings, ranging from tiny, rocky outcrops to larger, tree-covered masses, their flat profiles like the backs of ancient sea creatures. Jessica sat at the bow, wrapped tightly in an old army jacket Nick had given her, eyes fixed on the approaching shoreline. Her nose was red from the cold wind, but as they drew nearer, she began to nod. A memory surfaced, and she sniffled. "This is it," she said, turning back to Nick, who sat confidently at the motor, a smile playing on his lips beneath his dark mustache. "This is the same island. I remember it now. We came here one weekend when I was a kid. I was 8 years old. We fished, made campfires. My dad had a friend who was a Coast Guard here. He arranged the boat, showed us around. What was his name? Uncle Mike? Or Matt? He used to lift me onto his lap. Mom laughed and Dad got grumpy. I brought my favorite doll back then, a blonde one with a mischievous grin, and I lost her here. I cried for days, but we never came back. Wouldn't it be funny if she's still here somewhere under a tree?" "Yeah, funny," Nick replied flatly, and Jessica's cheeks burned with embarrassment. Sometimes the way he looked at her made her feel boring, stupid, too old for him, and somehow too big. She ran a hand through her hair, adjusted the black knit cap he'd given her. "Put it back on," Nick said irritably, glancing around. The bay was empty, except for a distant boat and some kids fishing near the shore. "You're already sniffling. You'll catch a cold and there goes our romantic weekend. I don't want to be running around with cold medicine while you lie in bed, hacking up a lung." He smiled, but only with one corner of his mouth. Jessica's heart lightened, and she quickly pulled the cap back on. "You're a doctor," she joked, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm safe with you. If anything happens, you can pop a shoulder back in, stitch a wound, do CPR. "Yeah, and if it comes to it, I can deliver a baby." Nick winked. "But I'm not a doctor yet. More like a medic. 2 more years of residency to go. Not that anyone's offering me a spot." "They will. You're talented. When we get back, there'll be letters waiting for you, invitations. Dr. Nick Harris, please join us." "Just wait and see." Nick laughed, steering the boat toward the island. They reached a long stone pier with rusted mooring rings embedded in the concrete. "Did you tell anyone where you were going? Or am I still your mysterious boyfriend, he who must not be named?" he teased. "You're still a mystery," Jessica admitted. "Who would I tell? I'm on vacation from work and I don't talk to many people. Just the girls sometimes. Besides, I thought we were going to Baltimore for a concert. Those tickets were expensive, right? I'm sorry." "Don't be," Nick said, hopping out of the boat and tying the rope to a ring. "You're worth it, Jess. I realized I didn't want to be in a crowd. I wanted this." He gestured around them. "Nature, silence, space, just us. This place is special to me." He held out his hand, and Jessica tried to step gracefully out of the boat but stumbled, nearly falling. She landed awkwardly on the rocks, and Nick smirked but said nothing. He grabbed their bags, a sturdy gray duffel, a backpack, and Jessica's floral tote. "Hold on to my belt," he instructed. "The rocks are slippery." They walked in single file, Nick leading the way, until they reached a narrow, overgrown path. "Have you brought anyone else here?" Jessica asked hesitantly. Nick paused, then shook his head. "Only once, a couple of years ago. A classmate. I thought what we had was special." He sighed and set the bags down. Jessica forced a smile, eager to change the subject. "You're such a pro camper. Look at all this gear. I probably packed junk food." "It's fine," Nick said. "We'll make do." He slid his duffel into a bush. "This has stuff for tomorrow. No need to lug it around." Jessica stared down the path, her eyes unfocused. In her mind, she saw her 8-year-old self, a blonde girl in a summer dress with a gap-toothed smile, laughing, twirling, waving, then vanishing into the trees. "There's a spring up ahead," she murmured. "It's about a 20-minute walk. Dad and I used to get water there. It was ice cold, almost blue. Mom said it was magical." "We don't need magic water," Nick said, hoisting his backpack. "We've got everything here. Ready?" Jessica checked her phone. "It's 4:30. No signal, though. Maybe if we climb that tower." "This was before your mom left for California, right?" Nick asked casually, adjusting his bag. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, making him look impossibly young, handsome, and distant. "Yeah," Jessica whispered. "Right before." They followed the path to an old cabin. Memories whispered from the trees. The sound of her mother's laughter, the weight of her doll in her arms, the crackle of a campfire, and the distant bark of seals. Jessica stayed silent, but when she saw the cabin, she couldn't help herself. Uncle Mike, or was it Matt, told a story about a moose that wandered onto the island when the bay froze over. The Coast Guards were fetching water when they ran into it. The moose got mad and chased them all the way back here. They locked themselves inside, but the moose got stuck on the narrow steps. They couldn't turn around, so they just stood there, bellowing. "And the guards?" Nick asked, amused. "They climbed out the window, grabbed axes, and... well, you can guess the rest." Nick chuckled. "Bet they ate well." Jessica shivered, suddenly imagining the slow, brutal death of the trapped animal. She thought she could hear its agonized scream. "They probably cut its legs first," Nick said thoughtfully. She flinched at the image. It was too real. "Let's go inside," he said, taking her hand. "It's getting late." Jessica tried to smile as they climbed the steps, but unease curled in her stomach. The island was the same as she remembered, yet everything felt different, like something was waiting for her. Chapter 2. Strange Signs and First Doubts. Inside the cabin, time seemed frozen. The air smelled of old wood, stale smoke, and salt. Jessica took a slow breath, memories swirling around her. As a child, she had jumped on the sagging couch, counted dead flies between the window panes, and traced her finger over faded navigation charts on the wall. She'd hidden behind the worn curtains, playing games with a younger version of herself. Now, she stood in the doorway, tears pricking her eyes. The cabin was exactly as she remembered, yet a sense of unease prickled her skin. Nick dropped his backpack with a thud. "We'll light a fire tomorrow," he said. "For now, why don't you boil some potatoes? Vodka goes better with food. Coke or juice?" "I don't like vodka," Jessica started. "I usually drink martinis with the girls." But when she saw Nick's face darken, she quickly added, "But vodka and Coke is fine, too." They moved to the tiny yellow-lit kitchen. A rickety table leaned on one leg, hastily replaced with an oar. A few mismatched cupboards clung to the walls, their doors hanging at odd angles. Nick rummaged through them and triumphantly pulled out 2 mismatched glasses. "Got 'em," he said, pouring drinks. Jessica unpacked canned food, sausage, and a bag of potatoes. She found a dented enamel pot, filled it with water, and began peeling. "It'll be fine," she whispered to herself. "He loves me. So what if I'm 6 years older? That's nothing these days." Nick returned, holding 2 glasses. "Talking to yourself again?" he teased. "You do that a lot. It's like you live in your own little world." He laughed, eyes glinting as he handed her a glass. "To love, Jess. And to a perfect weekend." Jessica took a tiny sip, grimacing at the burn. Nick drained his glass in one go. "Come on, finish it," he urged, refilling her glass. "I'm hungry," she protested. "If I drink now, it'll go straight to my head." "Fine," he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You peel. I'll supervise." Jessica forced a smile and focused on the potatoes. Nick wandered out of the kitchen, his footsteps creaking across the old floorboards. He called back, saying he'd be right outside. Jessica finished peeling, set the pot on the stove, and turned on the gas. The blue flame flickered to life. She poured water, watched it bubble and boil, the noise oddly soothing. She took a sip of her drink. Her head swam, vision blurring for a second. Jessica shook it off, added salt to the water, and turned around. Her gaze fell on two glasses sitting side by side. She frowned, trying to remember which one was hers. It didn't matter, she decided, taking a cautious sip from the nearest one. "Don't drink that," a voice said behind her. A low, melodic voice. Jessica spun around. The kitchen was empty, but the air felt colder. A chill crawled up her spine. She forced a laugh. "Get a grip, Jess. You're just tired." She took another sip, then stepped into the living room. Nick had left his glass half full. She set hers beside it, their rims clinking softly. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar. Jessica hesitated, then pushed it open. Her breath caught. In the corner, propped against a pillow, was her doll. The blonde hair was tangled, the lashes half gone, but those brown eyes still glinted mischievously. "Molly?" Jessica whispered. She picked up the doll, cradling it against her cheek. The smell of dust and old fabric filled her nose. She laughed, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You were here all along." She set the doll back on the bed. "I missed you," she whispered. Returning to the living room, she dropped onto the sagging couch. The two glasses were still there, waiting. Jessica took another sip, the burn of alcohol a little less harsh this time. Nick reappeared, smelling of cold air and smoke. He sat down, watching her. "Drink up," he said softly. Jessica hesitated, then drank, the warmth spreading through her. She smiled, but Nick's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. They sat in silence, the shadows growing longer. Nick's gaze drifted toward the dark windows, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the armrest. "You know," he said, "I wonder how long it takes for someone to realize they're completely alone out here." Jessica blinked. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, his smile returning. "Never mind. Let's eat." She tried to stand, but the room spun. The floor felt unsteady, like she was on a boat again. Jessica grabbed the edge of the table, her fingers numb. I need some air," she murmured. "Sit down," Nick said, his voice cold. "You'll be fine. We just need to spend more time together. That's why we're here." Jessica's heart pounded. The cozy cabin now felt like a trap. She glanced toward the door, but Nick's eyes followed hers. "Relax, Jess," he whispered. "We have all the time in the world." The shadows deepened, swallowing the last of the light. Chapter 3. Nick's Death and the Terror in the Woods. Jessica's head throbbed. The dim light in the cabin seemed too sharp, and a cold sweat covered her back. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Nick?" Her voice trembled. No response. The front door was ajar, letting in a draft that made the curtains shiver. Jessica stepped outside. The air was sharp and salty, the sun dipping low on the horizon. She wrapped the army jacket tighter around her, her breath misting in the cool air. "Nick?" she called again. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement near the edge of the trees. Nick stood with his back to her, staring into the woods, his hands clenched into fists. "Nick, what are you doing out here?" she asked, stepping toward him. He didn't answer. He turned slowly, his face pale and tight, eyes dark with something she couldn't name. "Why are you out here?" she repeated, her heart pounding harder. "I needed some air," he said, his voice flat. He took a step closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "You didn't tell anyone where you were going, did you?" Jessica blinked. "Number, you know I didn't." His mouth twitched into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good." A chill ran through her, more biting than the wind off the bay. "Let's go back inside," she whispered. "It's cold." Nick didn't move. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he shrugged and turned toward the cabin. Jessica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She followed him up the steps, but something in her gut screamed at her to turn around, to run. He held the door open and she stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin feeling false, like a trap. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Jessica's eyes darted around the room. The shadows seemed deeper, the air colder. Nick moved toward the table, his footsteps deliberate. He picked up the glass, swirling the dark liquid inside. "Let's finish our drinks," he said softly. Jessica's stomach churned. The drink in her hand felt heavy, like lead. She set it down carefully. "I don't feel well," she muttered. "I think I need to lie down." Nick's eyes narrowed. "You're always running away," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just like everyone else." Her heart skipped a beat. "Nick, what are you talking about?" He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across her face. "I brought you here for a reason, Jess." She took a step back, bumping into the wall. "You're scaring me." His eyes glinted. "You should be." Before she could react, he lunged. Jessica screamed, ducking under his arm and bolting for the door. She wrenched it open and ran. Her feet pounded the rocky path, branches whipping her face. She didn't dare look back. The woods closed around her, dark and cold. Her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. A sickening crunch split the air. Jessica skidded to a halt, her heart hammering. She turned around slowly. Nick was gone. A few feet away, a twisted figure lay on the rocks below the cliff's edge. Nick's limbs were bent at impossible angles, his face obscured by blood and shadow. Jessica clapped a hand over her mouth, bile rising in her throat. She stumbled backward, her mind screaming that this wasn't real, couldn't be real, but the body didn't move. Nick was dead. She sank to her knees, gasping for air. The world tilted, the edges blurring. Then she heard it. A rustle in the trees, soft footsteps, barely audible. Jessica's head snapped up. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The woods were silent, but she felt eyes watching her, cold and hungry. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling. She had to get back to the cabin. She had to call for help. Her phone. She'd left it inside. Jessica turned, her eyes scanning the darkening woods. The path back to the cabin seemed longer, the shadows deeper. She took a shaky step forward. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a sound that froze her blood. A low, guttural laugh. Jessica broke into a run, tears streaming down her face. Branches clawed at her arms. Roots threatened to trip her, but she didn't stop. She burst through the cabin door, slamming it behind her. Her fingers fumbled with the lock. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving. Silence. She sank to the floor, tears blurring her vision. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Nick was dead. She'd seen him fall, but something, or someone, was still out there. A cold draft brushed her neck. She turned her head slowly, dread curling in her stomach. The window was open, and the curtains fluttered like ghostly hands reaching for her. Chapter 4. Revelations and Island Secrets. Jessica sat on the cold floor of the cabin, her back pressed against the door. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The window's curtain fluttered, the wind carrying whispers from the dark woods outside. She forced herself to move, to stand. Her legs trembled as she crossed the room to the window. She peered out into the night. The forest was a wall of shadows, shifting and breathing. Nothing stirred. A sharp pain jolted her shoulder. She winced, rolling it to ease the tension. Her mind buzzed, half-formed thoughts slipping away before she could grasp them. Nick was dead. She'd seen his broken body on the rocks, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it was stronger now. Jessica grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter, her fingers shaking. She pressed the power button. Nothing. dead. The battery was drained, or maybe it was broken. She couldn't remember the last time she charged it. Her eyes darted around the room. She needed a plan. She needed to get off this island. The boat. Jessica stumbled to the door, hesitating for a heartbeat before unlocking it. The night air was cold and damp, wrapping around her like a shroud. The path to the pier stretched ahead, a narrow strip of darkness between the trees. She moved quickly, her breath fogging in the air. The forest seemed closer now, the branches reaching out like twisted fingers. Every step felt like it echoed, the sound swallowed by the night. The pier loomed ahead, the boat still tied to the mooring ring. Relief surged through her. She hurried forward, her fingers fumbling with the rope. The knot was tight, stiff with salt and neglect. She tugged at it, her breath coming faster. A twig snapped behind her. Jessica froze. The hair on her neck stood on end. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness. The forest was silent, empty. A shadow moved. Jessica's heart stopped. The silhouette of a person stood at the edge of the trees, just standing, watching. "Nick?" she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. The figure didn't move. Jessica's hands shook. She turned back to the rope, frantically working at the knot. Her fingers were numb, clumsy. The rope came loose. She climbed into the boat, heart pounding. The motor. She needed to start the motor. She jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. Nothing. "No, no, no!" she cried, trying again. The motor sputtered, coughed, and died. Tears filled her eyes. She twisted the key again, her knuckles white. A low, guttural laugh echoed across the water. Jessica's blood turned to ice. She looked up. The figure was gone. A splash behind her. She spun around, but there was only the dark water, rippling gently against the boat. Her hands trembled on the oars. The motor was useless. She'd have to row. She pushed off the pier, the boat rocking beneath her. The oars dipped into the water, and she pulled, muscles straining. The shore slipped away. The island grew smaller, the dark trees blending into a shapeless mass. Jessica rowed harder, her arms burning. The night was endless, the water stretching in all directions. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. A cold wind whispered across the bay. The boat shuddered. Jessica's grip tightened on the oars. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. The island was gone. The shore was gone. There was only water, endless and black. Panic clawed at her chest. She rowed blindly, her mind screaming. A light flickered ahead. Her heart leaped. A lighthouse? A boat? She rowed toward it, hope blooming in her chest. The light grew brighter, closer. It was steady, unmoving. Jessica's smile faltered. The light wasn't coming from a lighthouse. It was coming from the island. She turned, dread pooling in her stomach. The island was right behind her. The trees loomed, the shadows deeper than before. She hadn't moved at all. Her hands fell from the oars. Tears streamed down her face. A figure stood on the shore, tall, still, its face hidden in shadow. "Welcome back, Jess," a voice whispered. The wind carried the words to her ears, cold and sharp. Her body went numb. The boat drifted closer, the waves pulling her back to the shore. She didn't fight it. The figure stepped forward, the shadows peeling away. It was Nick. His face was pale, his eyes empty. Blood stained his clothes, his limbs twisted unnaturally. But he smiled. "Did you really think you could leave me?" he whispered. Jessica's scream tore through the night. Chapter 5. The Return of the Past. Jessica's scream shattered the night, but the sound vanished into the darkness like a stone sinking into deep water. She stumbled backward, her boots scraping against the wooden pier. Nick, if it really was Nick, took a step closer. His eyes, pale and empty, reflected the moonlight like twin shards of glass. His twisted limbs didn't seem to stop him. He moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, as if invisible strings pulled him forward. "Nick, you're dead," Jessica whispered, her voice raw with fear. He smiled, lips stretching too far over his teeth. "Death is just a door, Jess. You opened it for me." She shook her head, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "No, this isn't real. You fell. I saw you die." His smile widened, his head tilting to one side. "Did you? Or did you just want to believe that?" Jessica's knees buckled. The pier felt unsteady beneath her feet, as if the wood itself had turned against her. "Why are you doing this?" she cried. We were happy?" Nick's face contorted, the grin collapsing into a sneer. "Happy?" He spat the word like poison. "You were a distraction, a little game to pass the time." Tears streamed down Jessica's face. The cold air stung her cheeks. She felt trapped, the darkness closing in, the water whispering just below her. Nick took another step forward. The shadows seemed to cling to him, writhing and twisting like smoke. Jessica's hand brushed against something cold and smooth. The oar. She tightened her grip on it, heart pounding. Nick's eyes flicked to the oar, and his smile returned. "You think you can fight me, Jess? You couldn't even fight your own doubts." She gritted her teeth, her fingers aching from the tight grip. "I'm not the same person I was." He laughed, a hollow, rasping sound. "Then show me." Jessica swung the oar with every ounce of strength she had, the wood connected with Nick's side, the impact jarring her arms. He staggered, a dark, wet sound escaping his lips. But he didn't fall. He straightened, his eyes blazing. "You'll have to do better than that." Jessica's stomach twisted. Her mind screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The boat, the forest, the cabin, everything felt like a trap. Then she remembered. The lighthouse. She glanced over her shoulder. The faint glow still pulsed on the horizon. It wasn't much, but it was a direction, a chance. Jessica turned and ran, her boots pounding the weathered planks of the pier. She heard Nick behind her, his steps uneven but relentless. She reached the end of the pier and leaped into the boat. Her hands fumbled with the oars, panic making her clumsy. "Jess!" Nick's voice was a guttural growl, close enough to feel on her skin. She pushed off, the boat lurching into the black water. The oars dipped, and she pulled, muscles screaming. The pier slipped away, Nick's figure a dark smear against the shadows. But he didn't stop. He stepped off the edge of the pier, his body sinking into the water. Jessica's heart froze. The water rippled and stilled. Then, with a sickening splash, Nick's head broke the surface. His eyes glowed with a cold, dead light. He was swimming toward her. Jessica rowed harder, tears and sweat blurring her vision. The lighthouse's glow wavered in the distance, a fragile beacon of hope. "Come back, Jess!" Nick's voice echoed across the water. "You can't run from this!" The boat scraped against something beneath the surface. Jessica gasped, the impact nearly knocking her overboard. She looked down. The water was clear, illuminated by a pale, unnatural glow. Faces stared back at her. Ghostly, twisted faces. Their mouths opened and closed in silent screams. Hands reached up, fingers brushing the bottom of the boat. Jessica screamed, pulling the oars with desperate strength. The boat lurched forward, the ghostly hands vanishing into the depths. Nick's voice grew fainter, the water closing around him. The lighthouse was closer now, the light steady and strong. Jessica's arms burned, but she didn't stop. She rowed toward the light, the darkness clawing at her heels. Finally, the boat slid onto the rocky shore. Jessica collapsed, her chest heaving. She turned, expecting to see Nick's face rising from the water. But the bay was empty. The night was silent. She staggered to her feet, the lighthouse looming above her. Its light swept across the water, casting long shadows on the rocks. Jessica took a step forward, her body aching. A voice whispered in the wind, "You can't escape." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. But the wind died, and the whisper faded. Jessica took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She wasn't safe yet, but she was alive, and that was enough.